Good evening. I'm Burke Townsend, chair of the philosophy department here at the university, and I'd like to welcome you to the 17th annual Bugbee Lecture. The Bugbee Lecture was instituted to honor Henry G. Bugbee, a former professor and chair of the Department of Philosophy. In addition to being a notable and influential philosopher and an esteemed colleague, Henry was known for his eloquence in writing and in storytelling, for his love of fly fishing and of the Montana wilderness. The Bugbee Lecture Series is intended both to honor Henry's contributions to philosophy and to serve further his love for that discipline. For the fourth year now, the Bugbee Lecture is part of the Presidential Lecture Series, and I would like to thank heartily both President George Dennison and Dean Jerry Fetz of the College of Arts and Sciences for their support for the Bugbee Lecture and for the Presidential Lecture Series generally. And while I'm on the topic of the Presidential Lecture Series, I would like to remind you that the next lecture in the series, the final for this year, will be by John Mearsheimer, who is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor with the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. And he will lecture on the timely topic, Why the U.S. Was Doomed to Fail in Iraq. Professor Mearsheimer's lecture will be 3 weeks from today, on Monday, April 25th, here again in the University Theater. And that is a change of location from the originally announced location for that lecture. Our speaker for this evening is Elliot Sober, the Hans Reichenbach Professor and the William Vilas Research Professor with the Philosophy Department at the University of Wisconsin. Professor Sober's accomplishments are truly impressive. He is the author or co-author of some 8 books, 2 edited collections, and a textbook, in addition to more than 200 published articles. His work is internationally known, having been translated into both Asian and European languages. He's lectured and served as a visiting professor at universities around the globe and received numerous awards for his work. Professor Sober's interests are largely in the general areas of philosophy of science, but with a special focus on issues in evolutionary biology. He is among that small group of philosophers who has had a direct influence among practicing scientists. He spent a term indeed as a visiting scientist with the Museum of Zoology at the University of Michigan. Several of his publications are jointly authored with biological scientists, including an influential book on the evolution of altruism. And he was recently recognized with the distinct honor of selection as a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Recognition has, of course, also come from his colleagues in philosophy, and he has served as president of both the Philosophy of Science Association as well as the Central Division of the American Philosophical Association. Beyond general honors and accomplishments, Professor Sober is particularly well situated to address the issues surrounding tonight's topic. Not only has he worked extensively on general conceptual issues in evolutionary biology, but he has also explored with great care the formal bases for the sorts of probabilistic inferences that lie at the heart of evolutionary thinking, and, purportedly at least, also at the heart of the most recent version of creationist thinking, intelligent design. Given the strength of public interest in creationist alternatives to evolutionary theory, and the many political skirmishes over a proposed role for such alternatives in our public schools, Professor Sober's address tonight will be of relevance not only for those of us with interest in the philosophy of science, but as well for any concerned citizen. I can think of no more appropriate topic today for a public address by a philosopher of science, and no more appropriate philosopher than Elliot Sober to deliver it. It is thus with very great pleasure and with no little anticipation that I call on Professor Sober to talk to us tonight about creationism versus evolution. Professor Sober, please.
Burke, thank you for those kind words. It's a pleasure to be here in Missoula and an honor to be giving a lecture to honor Henry Bugbee. Well, as Burke explained, I'm going to be talking about a very old philosophical problem, but also a problem that has a great deal of contemporary relevance for our country, in the narrow sense that there is an ongoing debate about whether creationism should be taught in high school biology classes, but in the wider sense, a deeper debate and controversy about what kind of country we want the United States to be. But what I'm going to do is not really I'm not going to be talking about the political context. I'm going to, as a philosopher, talk about this very old argument, the argument from design, an old argument for the existence of God. I'm going to be trying to give it the strongest representation that I can, and then I'm going to try to explain to you what I think is defective about the argument. Now, I want to make it clear at the outset that I don't think faith in God depends on whether you buy this argument. Philosophers are familiar with the fact that there are many arguments that attempt to prove that God exists. And in addition to the possibility that there might be rational arguments for believing in God, there's also the possibility that people, as a matter of faith, should decide that believing in God is something that's right for them. And nothing I'll say tonight is intended to undermine that faith or that belief. I'm talking about one argument and one argument only for the claim that God exists. There's a second clarification that I have to make as well. People who defend creationism, which, as you'll see in a minute, basically makes use of this old philosophical argument, the argument from design, often present it as as a choice, that you have to either reject evolution, or if you believe that evolution has occurred, you're obliged to be an atheist. And I have to say that it's not just creationists who present this dilemma, this choice between reject evolution or embrace atheism, but indeed some defenders of evolutionary theory have also portrayed evolutionary theory as leading inevitably to the denial that God exists. I think this is a mistake. And what you see before you under 1 and 2 are two different models for how God might be involved in the world we live in. In the first one, which goes by the name theistic evolutionism, God creates the universe and the laws of nature that govern natural processes, and those natural processes in the fullness of time generate the observations that we make. So God starts the world off and then stands back for the most part and let natural processes play themselves out. The second, which is I think the model that creationists and their descendants, intelligent design theorists, the model that they embrace, is different. God, of course, still creates the universe and the natural processes that occur in it, and those natural processes are part of what explains the observations that we occur. But in addition to natural processes producing the observations we occur, God is intervening directly. So the thought behind the second model, the creationist model, is that mindless natural processes are not competent, even when set in motion by God, to produce the complicated adaptations that we observe organisms to have. Now, if you think of, and I think creationists and also atheistic evolutionists basically think of the situation as either 2 is true or atheism is true. But in fact, there are several more alternatives. There's the first alternative, which does not involve denying that evolution occurs. It just sees God as starting the universe off and giving it a kind of direction. And in addition to 1 and 2, which are both theistic doctrines, theistic models in which God is playing a role, there, of course, is atheistic evolutionism and agnostic evolutionism. And you can visualize what these involve by looking at the first model of theistic evolutionism and either putting a question mark where God is, and that would be agnostic evolutionism, or scratching that first entry out, and that would be atheistic evolutionism. Now, I hope you see what I'm getting at when I see that when I'm saying to you that the theory of evolution is not an atheistic doctrine. By itself, it doesn't claim that God exists. It doesn't claim that God does not exist. It says nothing on that subject. The evolutionary theory is about life processes. It's about life once it gets started and as it develops to the present day. How the universe began is not a problem in biology. That's a problem for physicists to talk about. Where the laws of nature come from is also not a problem for biologists either. So I view evolutionary theory as neutral on the question of whether God exists. There are theistic evolutionists who adopt the first model, but also there are agnostic and atheistic evolutionists as well. So what I'm saying to you is that the choice is wider than just the idea evolution or God. There are several of the options up there have both evolution and God. Well, as I say, I'm going to be criticizing the design argument, and I'm going to be one of the people portrayed in this slide who's going to be criticizing creationism. And I have to be very careful, as any critic must be, to decide which of two criticisms I want to develop. I can either claim that creationism is not a testable theory, it's not really a scientific theory at all, or I can argue that there's actually evidence against creationism being true. Some critics of creationism have stumbled into the mistake of defending both of these criticisms at the same time. I don't think that makes much sense. If you think that it's untestable, then presumably there isn't any evidence for or against it. So you can't have it both ways if you're a critic. And I hope you'll listen attentively to figure out which of these two options I'll be endorsing in my criticism of creationism. Well, what I want to start with is a version of creationism that's a beautiful argument. It was invented 50 years before Darwin published The Origin of Species, and this was not the first statement of the argument from design. It's part of this ongoing tradition that's had a long history in philosophy. It's a beautiful argument that involves a kind of analogy, which I'll get to in a minute. Paley describes walking across an open field, a heath in England, and coming upon a stone, which he kicks with his foot. And he says, if you ask yourself how this stone got here and how it came to have the properties it has, you'd feel no particular need to say, oh, the stone must have been designed by some intelligent being who wanted it to exist and wanted it to have the properties we exist. You'd be perfectly content with the idea that mindless processes of floods and lightning and erosion and so on could have created that stone. And it would never occur to you, he says, to think that an intelligent designer has to be part of the explanation for why the stone exists, why it has the characteristics it has. Paley goes on to say that if you found a watch as you walked across the heath, you'd take a profoundly different view. You'd look at this watch, you'd notice that it's beating out regular intervals of time. You'd open the back of it and see that it's an intricate machine made of gears that are coordinated with each other. You'd notice that if one of those gears was out of place, the watch would not keep time accurately. And you say to yourself, what could explain the existence of this watch? What could explain these characteristics that we observe it to have? Paley says you might contemplate the possibility that the watch came to exist by mindless natural processes, lightning striking the ground, erosion washing stones down from the top of the hill. You might think maybe the watch came about by mindless processes, but Paley says, I think what all of us would say, that is simply not a plausible explanation. The intricacy of the design of the watch cries out for the hypothesis that it was the result of an intelligent designer's wanting to make the watch and carrying through on his intention. So in the case of the watch, he sets you up this way. He says there are two possibilities you could consider. One that is that the watch is just the result of mindless chance processes. The second possibility is that the watch was created by an intelligent designer. And Paley says that the only plausible explanation for the watch and the characteristics we observe the watch to have is that it was made by an intelligent designer. And here's where the beautiful, really profound analogy, I'll suggest later a misleading analogy, but this is where Paley's argument gets going. He says, suppose you were looking not at the watch, but you were examining the eye that human beings and other vertebrates have. And you ask yourself the same question about the vertebrate eye that you previously had considered about the watch. What explains its existence? What explains its having the characteristics we observe it to have? And as before, you could consider chance as a possible explanation, or you could consider intelligent design. And Paley says, just as you reasoned about the watch, so should you reason about the eye. It's possible, maybe, that the eye could have come into existence by a mindless chance process, but surely that's enormously implausible. It's far more plausible to think that the eye came into existence by the same kind of process that brought into existence the watch. An intelligent designer made the eye. And this intelligent designer, of course, you realize, is none other than God. The difference between the watch and the eye, of course, is the watch is pretty complicated and pretty good at keeping time, but Paley's thinking that the eye and other complicated adaptations that organisms have are far more complicated than the watch, far more perfect than it, and so the intelligent designer who made the eye has to be far smarter than the intelligent designers who made the watch, smarter than a human being, hence God exists. That's Paley's version of the design argument for the existence of God. Now, there are three reactions you might have to Paley's argument, and you'll find people out there in the world who believe each of these. The first argument says that it was a pretty good argument given the materials that Paley had to work with until 1859, but once Darwin's theory was developed in 1859, there was a new theory on the table, and that theory is a better theory than the design argument. So the picture that you get under this first kind of reaction is intelligent design is better than chance, as Paley said, but Darwin put a third possibility on the table that, of course, Paley could never have thought of. He lived too early, namely the theory of evolution by natural selection. And the reaction I'm describing now says that just as design is a better theory than chance, so evolution by natural selection is a better theory than design. First reaction. Many biologists have that reaction, and I'll talk about one of them in a minute. There's a second reaction, which is that it was never a good argument, not before Darwin, not after, not ever. It's defective in ways that you can identify without having to think about the details of evolutionary theory or indeed any scientific theory. That's the second possible reaction. And of course, the third reaction is the reaction that creationists or intelligent design theorists have. They think that Paley's argument was sound way back when. It's sound now, even though Darwinism has come up as a new possible scientific theory. It's still inferior to what Paley was defending, the theory of intelligent design. Well, I now want to talk about a scientist who's defended the first reaction, and that's Stephen Jay Gould, who has a very famous argument based on an example that he calls the panda's thumb. I put thumb into quotation marks because if you look at the paw of the panda, the thing that Gould was talking about is not an opposable digit, but rather a spur of bone that sticks out from here, from its wrist. It's a wrist bone. And what the panda does is spend about 22 hours a day taking bamboo stems and running it through the groove between its paw and this thumb, this rigid extension of its wrist bone. And gradually but surely it prepares those bamboo stems for consumption. Pandas are vegetarian bears, and bamboo is about all they eat. So that's what we observe, and Gould is very taken with the fact that the panda's thumb is an enormously inefficient device for preparing food for the panda. It spends most of its waking life fixing up stuff to eat. And Gould says that if an intelligent designer, if God made the panda's thumb, surely the panda would have a far more efficient device than this rather crummy, imperfect wrist bone thing, in which it spends, as I say, 22 hours a day going like that with. And so the imperfection we observe in the panda's thumb is evidence that an intelligent designer did not make the panda's thumb. Rather, the panda's thumb is the result of the mindless process of natural selection. So Gould is saying that Paley was enchanted with the perfection, what he thought was the perfection of nature. But once you look more carefully at many of the characteristics that organisms have, you see that nature is not a perfect place. You see many highly imperfect makeshift adaptations. Gould's view is that this is evidence against intelligent design, evidence for a process that's liable to produce such makeshift imperfect adaptations, namely the process that Darwin described. Now, I don't know how many of you are sympathetic with creationism, but I think it's pretty clear how a creationist could and should respond to Gould's argument. Gould is assuming that if God wanted to make a panda, he would have produced a far more perfect thumb for the panda or set of adaptations for the panda than we in fact observe. But how does Steve Gould know what God would want to do if he built a panda? Gould has no clue about this. He's simply assuming that if God set his mind to making a panda, he would have built a very different organism from the organism we actually observe. And I think creationists could say, well, maybe God was concerned that the pandas not consume bamboo too fast. Because after all, if they consumed it super fast, they would eat themselves into oblivion. Perhaps that would cause pandas to go extinct. Perhaps that would cause a crash in the entire ecosystem. So maybe the inefficiency of the panda's thumb is part of God's plan to keep the whole ecosystem in balance. And I think that I don't know whether that's right, but it's certainly a possibility. And what I'm saying to you is, I don't think Gould knows that that's incorrect. Gould does not know what God would have had in mind if he had built a panda. And so I think that that's not a good criticism of the design argument. And it's interesting to note that if you go back and actually read Paley, Paley says that if you find imperfect adaptations in nature, this is not an objection to the argument for intelligent design that he's making. And he says, quite reasonably, if you found a watch on the heath and the watch did not keep perfect time, but maybe it lost a few seconds every day, that wouldn't lead you to embrace the idea that the watch is the result of mindless chance processes. You'd still think to yourself, quite reasonably, Paley says, that the watch is the product of an intelligent designer. So Paley's point is, I think, correct, that there's no commitment in creationism, there's no commitment that's part of the theory of intelligent design to every adaptation being perfect. And Gould's argument to the contrary is based on assumptions that he has no right to assume. So I don't know whether how many of you are of one persuasion or another, but I hope we can all recognize that Gould is simply inventing assumptions about the so-called the putative intelligent designer. Given those assumptions, his argument works, but we want to question the assumptions, and I think Gould has no reason to endorse those. So that's what's wrong, I think, with this particular criticism of creationism. And I hope you'll bear that in mind as I eventually get to the point where I'm going to develop my own criticism of creations. Let me repeat it once more. Gould tries to show that intelligent design is a poor theory, that it should be rejected in favor of Darwinism. Why does he say that? He says when you look at nature, you see imperfect adaptations like the panda's thumb. And then he says, and this is where I want to say no, he says, the imperfect adaptations that you see would never exist if an intelligent designer built pandas and organisms. And I want to say, how does he know what organisms would look like if an intelligent designer made them? Maybe there's some reason that the intelligent designer would have had to produce the panda in the form we observe it. So that's what I think is wrong with Gould's argument. Well, what I want to do now is consider different versions of the design argument and try to work my way towards the version of the argument that I think is the strongest, the intellectually most secure argument. And as I've said before, I'm going to then try to show that even with respect to the strongest argument, the strongest version of the design argument, there's still a problem with the argument. But let's work up to that slowly. So consider this version of the argument. First, it has two premises. It says if the watch weren't made by an intelligent designer, the watch couldn't possibly have the features we observe it to have. But of course, the watch does have those features. And of course, it follows from the two premises that the watch was made by an intelligent designer. Now, I think that Paley would reject this argument, and many other defenders of the design argument, writing in the 18th and 19th century, would also reject this argument. They'd say that, well, I believe the design argument, but that's not my argument. I don't want to endorse that. And that's because they recognized that there are processes other than intelligent design, monkeys and typewriters, if you like, which have the possibility of producing the features we observe. Paley points out that it's not impossible for a mindless process to result in a watch. It's simply very improbable that it do so. So I think Paley and other defenders of the design would say, well, the first premise is overstated. It's not true that it couldn't possibly have those features. The most you can say is that those features would be improbable if there were no intelligent designer. And so I move to my second version of the argument. It says that if the watch was made by a mindless process, it probably wouldn't have the features we observe. Not that it couldn't, but it probably wouldn't. The watch has the features we observe, and so the conclusion is drawn that we should reject the hypothesis that the watch was made by a mindless process. Here's my problem with this second version of the argument. There are lots of perfectly good theories, perfectly good hypotheses that say that some observations are improbable. So, for example, consider the hypothesis that this coin is fair. That means that the probability of its landing heads is the same as the probability of its landing tails each time I toss it, namely a half. Suppose I toss this coin 1,000 times and record the sequence of heads and tails that I get. What's the probability of getting that exact sequence of heads and tails if the coin is fair? Well, the answer is it's a half times a half times a half times a half 1,000 times. It's a half to the 1,000th power, which is an exceedingly small number. But I think we'd be making a mistake having observed this sequence of 1,000 heads and tails to say, oh, I'm going to reject the hypothesis that the coin is fair, because after the probability of this outcome, given the hypothesis that the coin is fair, is very small. In science, we do not reject hypotheses just because they say that what we observe is extremely improbable. There are plenty of good hypotheses that say that this or that observation has a very low probability. So I don't regard this as a good version of the design argument at all. And so I move to a different approach. The first two approaches that I was talking about didn't really compare the design hypothesis with any alternative hypothesis. It said, the first argument says that if the design hypothesis weren't true, then you couldn't observe what you observe. The second one says if it weren't if it weren't an intelligent designer, you probably wouldn't observe what you observe. The third one says, wait a minute, we have to try to articulate two competing theories and try to compare each of them by seeing what each of them predicts about what we observe, figure out which of them is better supported by the evidence. So we're looking for a framework in which we're going to compare the design hypothesis with some alternative and evaluate each of them in the light of what they say about the observations we make. So how do we do that? Well, here's an example from coin tossing that I think points in the direction of the kind of interpretive principle we want to use. So here's the example. We toss a coin. It lands 503 times in 1,000 tosses. And we want to consider the two hypotheses you see up there. The first one says the coin is fair. That means the probability of heads is the same as the probability of tails, 1/2. The second one says that the coin is heavily biased, say 0.95, in favor of landing heads each time you toss it. Now, if you got 503 heads in 1,000 tosses, which of these hypotheses is better supported by that set of observations? And the principle that I want to use for the rest of my lecture is called the law of likelihood. And it says that you should view the observations as pointing towards that hypothesis that says that the observations are more probable. So we have this vertical symbol here. I wish I had a laser pointer. This means the probability of the observations given that H1 is true. This means the probability of the observations given that H2 is true. And what the law of likelihood says is, look, the observations are extremely improbable if H2 is true. If the coin were heavily biased towards heads, you wouldn't expect, you'd have a very low probability for there being 503 out of 1,000 heads in the trials you ran. On the other hand, if the coin is fair, that outcome is more probable. So the probability of the outcome given the first hypothesis is greater than the probability of the outcome given the second hypothesis. Both of them are low. The probability of getting 503 out of 1,000 is low given each, but it's bigger if H1 is true than it is if H2 is true. And the law of likelihood says you should interpret the evidence as favoring H1 over H2 in that case. So what I want to do is use the law of likelihood as the interpretive tool for trying to formulate what I think is the strongest version of the design argument, the argument that Paley formulated. Well, let's start with the watch argument. And so we want to consider the alternatives that Paley considered. The watch was made by an intelligent designer versus the watch was made by some mindless chance hypothesis. And we observe the features that this watch has, and we ask ourselves, what's the probability that the watch would have these features if it were the result of a mindless chance process? And what's the probability of the watch having these features if it were made by an intelligent designer? And we want to compare these two probabilities. That's what we're going to do. Here's Paley's argument set up using the law of likelihood. You start by describing the features that the watch has. You then assert, correctly I think, that the watch will have those features with higher probability if it was made by an intelligent designer than it would if the watch were simply the result of some mindless chance process. And you conclude from that that the features that you see the watch have favor intelligent design over chance. And I think this is a perfectly good argument. Paley was not misleading us in saying that's the sensible way to interpret the watch when you find it on the heath. But I think there's an assumption behind Paley's argument, which I'm going to describe and then say it's a fine assumption. But what I want to say for now is that it's a perfectly good argument. The watch argument is a perfectly good argument if you make a certain reasonable assumption, which I'll describe later. Okay, that's the watch argument that Paley made set up as a likelihood argument using the law of likelihood. Let's do the same thing now with the eye argument. Okay, so you describe the features that the vertebrate eye has. You note that the probability of the eyes having those features, if it were the result of a mindless chance process, is tiny, really tiny, not zero, but tiny. And then you note that the probability that the eye would have the features we observe it to have if it were made by an intelligent designer is bigger than tiny. And the law of likelihood then tells you that you ought to interpret your observation of the eye's features in the same way that you earlier interpreted your observation of the watch's features, namely what you see in the watch's features to be favor intelligent design over chance. And here's where I start to tip my hand a little bit. I think the third premise of this argument is a problem, and I'm going to try to explain why. But so far, I hope you're moved by Paley's analogy. You're saying to yourself, well, what he says about the watch seems totally reasonable. Surely intelligent design is more plausible than chance in the case of the watch. And what's the big deal changing from the watch to the eye when we're talking about the vertebrate eye? The same conclusion seems reasonable. Intelligent design is better supported than chance. Likelihood tells us why. So what's the difference? It's not a misleading analogy. It's a beautiful analogy, an apt analogy. I hope you're thinking this thought. I want to say that there's something wrong with that thought. I'm getting there. Okay, let's consider the watch argument in a little bit more detail than we did. It's a likelihood argument. We've got to ask ourselves, which of the hypotheses we're considering, intelligent design or chance, makes the observations more probable? And you'll remember that the watch argument is set up, the second premise just says the features we observe the watch to have are more probable if an intelligent designer made the watch than they would be if mindless chance processes made the watch. And I want to now show you that there's an assumption that's built into this second premise. What is the assumption? Well, with respect to the watch, whether intelligent design is more or less likely than chance depends upon the goals and the abilities that the designer has. So let's suppose that the way I've set up this table, the goals are either here or here. Either this intelligent designer we're talking about wants to make a watch with those features or does not. And the abilities that the intelligent designer has are either on the left or on the right. The designer either knows how to make a watch with those features or does not. So there are four possibilities. These two crossed with those two. And these are, so we want to think about these four possibilities. Well, consider the assumption that the intelligent designer wants to make a watch with those features and has the ability to do so, then it's pretty certain that the watch is going to have the features we observe if it was made by that kind of intelligent designer, namely an intelligent designer who has the ability and has the goal of producing a watch that looks just like that. But if the intelligent designer we're talking about either lacks the ability or lacks the goal, then it's not true that the watch is more probable to look the way it does if it was made by that kind of intelligent designer than if it were made by chance. So consider a designer who does not want to make a watch with the features we observe, and in any event doesn't even know how to make a watch that looks like the watch we observe. Then the probability of the watches having those features, if that's the designer we're talking about, is zero. Or as close to it as makes no difference. So the point I'm trying to communicate here is when Paley, in discussing the watch, says in his second premise that the watch as having the features we observe it to have is more probable if an intelligent designer made it than would be the case if it were made by a random chance process, that second premise is true if we make certain assumptions about the goals and abilities of the designer we're talking about. Namely, if we assume that the intelligent designer we're talking about wants to make watches that are made out of metal and have gears and numbers and say Bristol on the bottom, if we assume that a designer wants to make a watch with those features and has the ability to do so, then Paley is entirely right in saying that the design hypothesis understood in that way has a higher likelihood than the mindless chance hypothesis. So what's wrong with that? Nothing. And that's because Paley, I think, was thinking about the kind of human designers that he knew about in his daily life. He knew that designers living in his own time and place often made machines out of metal and glass. They often had gears and pulleys in them. This was something that the designers he was thinking about, namely the human beings he was living with, knew how to make and liked to make. So he was basically assuming implicitly that the designer we're talking about is like an 18th century Englishman, like the craftsman in England that Paley knew about. And of course, if that's the kind of designer you're talking about, then it's far more probable that the watch will have the features we observe if that kind of designer made it than would be the case if the watch were made by a mindless chance process. So I think Paley's argument here is fine when he's talking about the watch. So what's the if? The if is Paley is assuming that the designer he's talking about had goals and abilities that are roughly similar to the goals and abilities of the craftsmen that he knew of in his native country. If that's the kind of designer you're talking about, this argument is fine. And I think that's why when we read the argument, we say, well, yeah, it's crazy to think that the watch could have been made by was made by a mindless chance process, because the kind of designers we know exist in England would easily and with high probability have made a watch that looks like that. So we're talking about human designers of the kind that Paley knew about. Given that way of formulating the design hypothesis, it's perfectly good. So I hope you see why I say in this slide which hypothesis is more likely, that is, which hypothesis makes the observations more probable, depends on something. It depends on what the goals and abilities are of the intelligent designer that we're talking about. It doesn't follow unconditionally. You can't say the design hypothesis makes the observations more probable than chance does, no matter what kind of designer you're talking about. That's not true, because if the designer is in either any of these other three cells, the probability of the watch having the features you observe is zero. And it's not beating chance when it says that the observations have a probability of zero. So that's the analysis I would give of the watch argument that Paley gave. It's a good argument given this assumption, which is a reasonable assumption given the context he was writing about. Let's now consider, and here's where my criticism of the design argument will be put before you. Let's consider the eye argument, the idea that the vertebrate eye should be interpreted as the result of intelligent designer rather than as a result of a mindless chance process, Which hypothesis, intelligent design or chance, makes the observed features of the eye more probable? Well, that also depends, just as we were saying about the watch. It all depends on what the goals and abilities are that you're talking about. So that's true also with respect to the eye. If you assume, and let's suppose, because it's interesting, that the property of the eye that we'll focus on is the fact that the eye has a blind spot. When light falls on a certain portion of the back of the eye, we see nothing because that's where the optic nerve comes in. That's the blind spot. So let's suppose we want to explain that feature that the vertebrate eye has, and we want to know what the probability is of the eyes having that feature if the eye were made by an intelligent designer, the probability of the eyes having that feature who was the result of a mindless chance process, and we want to know which hypothesis, design or chance, makes that observation more probable. Well, it all depends. If you think that the intelligent designer knew how to make an eye with a blind spot and wanted to make an eye with a blind spot, then intelligent design beats chance. That's the upper left-hand cell of this table. Then the observed blind spot has a way higher probability according to the intelligent design hypothesis than it has according to the chance hypothesis. And so the law of likelihood tells you if that's the kind of designer you're talking about, then when you see the eye have the features that it has, that's evidence favoring intelligent design as opposed to chance. But if you reconceptualize what this designer is like, if you think that the designer either didn't want to make an eye with a blind spot or didn't know how, or both, then the situation reverses. Because in either of those two cases, there's no chance at all. There's no probability at all that the eye will have the features we observe if an intelligent designer of that sort made the eye. So when you observe the eye have the features it does, what do these observations tell you? Do they favor intelligent design or do they favor chance? And what I'm saying here is it all depends on what you assume about the goals and abilities of this intelligent designer you're thinking about. If you make one set of assumptions, favorable assumptions, then of course intelligent design beats chance. You make other assumptions about the intelligent designer's goals and abilities, the reverse is true. Chance makes the observations more probable than intelligent design does. It all depends. That's the lesson I draw from this, just like it's the lesson I drew in connection with the watch argument. So what's the difference between the two arguments? If they sound so similar, Paley thinks they're similar, why aren't they similar? Well, I think the watch argument is fine because Paley was talking about human designers of the sort he knew about. If you take that to specify what the goals and abilities are, the watch argument works fine. But in the case of the eye, we're talking about some unspecified sort of designer. Are we talking about human beings? What's the probability that a human being in the 18th century could make the vertebrate eye? Well, zero. They didn't have the know-how, much less the desire. So we're talking about something other than a human designer. Well, what kind of a designer are we talking about? Are we talking about a designer who wants to give the eye a blind spot? A designer who doesn't want to give the eye a blind spot? What kind of designer are we talking about? And the point I want to make is that we don't know what the designer's goals and abilities are. That's, for me, the crucial difference between the eye argument and the watch argument. The watch argument, we know about the designer's goals and abilities because we're really talking about human designers. In the case of the eye argument, we're talking about some non-human designer, but we have no knowledge of what that designer's goals and abilities are. And so we don't know which of these squares we're in. We don't know whether we should assume the designer wants to make what we observe happen or wants that to be the last thing in the world that is going to happen. We have no way. So we have no way of saying which of the two hypotheses makes the observations more probable. That's what I see as the difference between what Paley says about the watch and what he says about the eye. It's a beautiful analogy, but I think it's misleading because of this difference. And that's what I think is incorrect about the design argument that attempts to show that God exists by asking how do we explain these complicated adaptive features that organisms have like the vertebrate eye. Let's go back to what Paley says about the stone. I mentioned this at the very beginning. Remember I said Paley says that when you see a stone on the heath, you have no inclination to think, oh, that must have been the result of an intelligent designer. You're perfectly happy with the idea that a mindless chance process made the stone. Well, how does Paley know that? How does he know what a designer, what the goals and abilities a designer would have with respect to the stone? Maybe a designer would want to make stones. And if you assume that, then the probability of the stones having those properties, if it were made by an intelligent designer, would be enormously high. So I think here, too, Paley is making assumptions about the goals and abilities of the designer. He's basically thinking to himself, the designer I want to talk about would have no particular interest in making stones. So the probability of stones having the properties they do if an intelligent designer made them is very low. Far better to think of it in terms of a mindless chance process being the reason stones have the features we observe. Well, here I think he's doing the same thing I was objecting to in connection with the eye. He's simply inventing assumptions about the goals and abilities that this designer he's talking about has, which allows him to say the things he thinks sound right. He wants to say that when you observe the stone, that's not evidence for an intelligent designer, but when you observe the eye, that is evidence. How do you get those results? You make assumptions, as I keep saying, about the goals and abilities that this designer you're talking about have. But the problem is that Paley is simply inventing these assumptions. If he had made opposite assumptions, he should have drawn the opposite conclusions. So what we need to break through this impasse is some independent reason to think that these are the goals and abilities that the designer would have if a designer made the eye or the stone or the watch. Sorry, scratch the watch. We need independent evidence for thinking that if the eye were made by an intelligent designer, these are the goals and abilities that the designer would have, not those. If we had that independent evidence, we could proceed and reach some definite conclusion about this argument. What doesn't work is simply inventing assumptions that allow us to get to the conclusions we want to draw, and I'm saying that's what Paley does in this argument. Here's another way that I can formulate my criticism. If you don't peek at the eye, tell me, what does the design hypothesis predict the eye will have as its features? And I think there's no way of saying, because the design hypothesis doesn't have any independent access to the kinds of eyes that the designer would want to make. So there's just no saying. And what we want is a theory that makes predictions based on these independently justified assumptions about the designer's goals and abilities, not a theory that's simply able to accommodate ex post facto. So I'm saying that what Paley does when he looks at the eye is he peeks, he sees what features it has, and he says, oh, the eye has a blind spot. The intelligent designer wanted it to have one. The eye has a cornea. Oh, guess what? The intelligent designer wanted the eye to have a cornea. But this is making up assumptions. It's not independently justifying it. Assumptions about the designer's goals and abilities. Now, I've criticized Paley's argument. I've criticized the design argument, and I haven't said one word pro or con about evolutionary theory. What I tried to do is show you that the design argument is defective regardless of what you may think about the plausibility of evolutionary theory. I think this is a defective argument. If it weren't for the highly misleading character of Paley's analogy, I think it would have been spotted a long time ago. And there's no reason to bring evolutionary theory in as a competitor. The design argument is defective on its own. Well, now I want to talk about the present and not about an argument that was made 200 years ago. I want to talk about contemporary intelligent design theory. Intelligent design theory is a new version of creationism. Intelligent design theorists do not like to be called creationists, and I'll say a little bit about why, but I hope I can show you that the arguments that they make are basically the same as the kinds of arguments that Paley made. Paley talked about the vertebrate eye. Mike Behe talks about some more modern biochemical examples, but the kind of argument is basically the same. And I want to say the defects in the argument for intelligent design theory are the same as the old problem that attaches to Paley's 1805 argument. So Paley, instead of talking about the vertebrate eye, talks about biochemical properties, like the very intricate processes that go on in our blood when we're cut that allow our blood to coagulate. And he asks, how could a complicated adaptation like that come about? Is it the result of an intelligent designer, or is it the result of a mindless chance process? Just like Paley asked in connection with the vertebrate eye. And the buzzword for Behe is irreducible complexity. That's what makes the mechanism of blood coagulation so special. What does that mean? Well, the idea is that simply if an organ or a process has a lot of parts, like the watch or the vertebrate eye, and if those parts will perform a useful function only if they're arranged just so, then we say that the organ or the process has irreducible complexity. So the mechanism of blood coagulation has irreducible complexity, as Behe says, and the same is true of the vertebrate eye. Paley was talking about the same interesting property of the eye that Behe gives a new name to. So here's how the arguments differ. Of course, Behe has as his target refuting evolutionary theory. Paley was writing 55 years before The Origin of Species, couldn't talk about a theory he didn't know about. And their examples are different, but I think what they have in common is fundamentally the same thing. That at heart, it's the same old argument. Namely, you have two hypotheses, intelligent design and chance, and you ask, what's the probability of the observations if the one is true? What's the probability of the observations if the other is true? Same argument. It's a likelihood argument. Well, let's consider what's true of features that have adaptive complexity. Is it true that they can't possibly be produced by a mindless process? Well, I mentioned before, Paley denies that. Behe himself concedes that there is a non-zero probability that mindless processes could produce complicated adaptations. He thinks the probability is very low. It's not zero. So the first claim is wrong. All parties agree to that. What about the processes described in evolutionary theory? Is it impossible for them to produce complicated adaptations? Again, the answer is just no. Well, maybe what we ought to be saying is that evolutionary theory, as it's currently constituted, says that the probability of the vertebrate eye, of blood coagulation, and so on, is very low. Not zero, but very low, given their understanding of the processes of evolution. Is that true? Well, I don't want to answer that question, but what I do want to say is that even if it is true that those features have a very low probability, according to evolutionary theory, that would not show anything is wrong with the theory. It would not be evidence for intelligent design either. And here I return to the idea of the law of likelihood. If you want to claim that a given observation is evidence against one theory and favors another, the two theories must both make predictions about what you observe. They both must tell you about how probable is this observation according to each theory. And the problem that I've been trying to clarify is that the theory of intelligent design, so-called theory of intelligent design, doesn't tell you how probable or improbable any observation is unless you help yourself to unjustified assumptions about the goals and abilities of the designer you want to talk about. So if you want to assume that an intelligent designer knows how to build a machine that coagulates blood in just this way and has the desire to do so, you're home free. Your theory is saying that the observations are highly probable. On the other hand, if you think that the intelligent designer wouldn't know how or wouldn't want to build a machine just like that, then the probability of the observations is very low. Take your pick. And here's where I get to my concluding negative remark about the theory of intelligent design. It's not a theory in any real scientific sense of the theory. If you ask, what does this theory say about the eye, the coagulation mechanism of the blood, there is no theory that says anything about the probability or improbability of those events arising. The theory is nothing more than the simple sentence, an intelligent designer made it. It says nothing about the goals and abilities that the designer has or the methods that the intelligent designer would use. It's a very simple theory. It's so brief that it really doesn't predict anything. So that's why I think that what was true of Paley's argument in 1805 is true today of intelligent design theory. It's not really a theory. It doesn't make any predictions. And so it can't be tested. So here's the big picture. How should you understand the design argument? And what I've been arguing is that the sort of strongest version of the argument is to set it up as a likelihood argument. And so you've got to figure out what's the probability of the observations if an intelligent designer is doing the work, and what's the probability of the observations if a random chance process is doing the work. And to answer this question, we've got to know what the designer's goals and abilities are, and I'm saying we don't know that. And so now let me come back to my early criticism of Gould. Gould criticized creationists by saying, if an intelligent designer built the panda's thumb, there's no way it would have that crummy, makeshift, extended wrist bone. And I said, what creationists ought to say to Gould is, how do you know what God would want to accomplish if he built a panda? And I think that was a defect in Gould's criticism of creationism. I'm making exactly the same criticism of the design hypothesis here when I look at the design argument's offered explanation for the features of the vertebrate eye or of blood coagulation. Intelligent designers don't have independent knowledge of what the goals and abilities of this designer would be, hence there's no way of completing the argument. Thank you. Sure.
Professor Sober will be willing to entertain some questions from the audience, and I'll try to help. It's virtually impossible to see you all here with the spotlight, so I'll look over here and serve as an auxiliary. Perhaps I can see and answer questions. There are microphones, I believe. There's at least one here that I see. If you could approach a microphone with your question, for us all to hear. Yes, sir.
Is this on? Okay. There are a lot of fossil examples of species that used to exist, and there are several fossil examples of species that still exist. Why aren't there just as many fossil examples of those so-called in-between stages between those that used to exist and those that exist now?
In my talk, I didn't defend evolutionary theory, and I think what you're asking is how evolutionary theory would answer that question. And I'm happy to say a little bit about that, but I do want to emphasize that the criticisms I've made of intelligent design do not depend on your thinking that the current state of play in evolutionary biology is adequate. It has nothing to do with the adequacy of evolutionary theory. But let me try to say a little bit about that. The picture of variation that Darwin had was that there's lots of very small variation that constantly exists in a population. So when a population evolves from one state to another, it moves by a set of very, very small steps through the available alternatives. So if we're going to get a polar bear to increase its fur length, say, and evolve from 5 centimeters to 9, the picture is that it's not going to jump from 5 to 9 all at once. It's going to make a set of very, very small changes from 5 to 5.1, 5.1 to 5.2, the population evolves. That was Darwin's theory of variation, that variation is small and that the changes that occur in evolution are gradual and small. And that picture dominated a good part of 20th century evolutionary biology as well. It's recently come into question, and the situation is much more complicated now because it's recognized now that some mutations are bigger, some are smaller, and some are really small. So there's a range of sizes. So sometimes populations will make rather larger jumps and sometimes rather smaller jumps. So the answer to so one part of the answer to the question, why aren't there intermediate species, will sometimes be that the nature of the genetic variation allowed these largest jumps to be made, and there just wasn't any such intermediate around. That's going to be part of the sort of modern scientific answer to your question. The other side of the question, let me give the other side of it. The other side of it is something that Darwin himself recognized, and I think it's still regarded as having some considerable validity, which is that the fossil record is incomplete, and there probably were some intermediaries historically that have simply disappeared. We don't know about them. So those are the two kinds of answers you need to think about the question, why don't we see these intermediaries? One is maybe they used to exist and don't. That's the second one I said. And the first one is maybe the nature of the variation allowed populations to, so to speak, skip some of the intermediate stages that we might naively expect them to have, that Darwin, in fact, expected them to have. I think your description of Gould's views is accurate. Let me enter like a small caveat. He, like all biologists, think that life began very simple, and then it had nowhere to go but increase in complexity. So it's sort of built into the fact that you start with very simple organisms, that evolution has got to increase the average complexity of the organisms that exist, at least for a while. So he thought that was true. But he did believe that there's no target towards which evolution is tending. He thought furthermore that what happens in the history of evolution is a highly contingent process. It depends on all sorts of accidents, like a meteor hitting the Yucatan Peninsula and wiping out the dinosaurs. That's a unique historical event. He thought that events like that fundamentally altered the path that evolution subsequently took. So besides it's not being directional, as you said, he also had he put a big emphasis on this idea of contingency. That was a big theme for him. But that's not universally accepted among biologists now. Biologists notice that many of the adaptations that we see have evolved multiple times. And if there was really a huge amount of contingency in evolution, you really wouldn't expect the eye to evolve multiple times. You'd expect that it requires just this set of circumstances, and so it should appear only once. That's not what we see. We have multiple originations, and so some biologists speculate not that there's some guiding hand producing this, but there's something about the nature of adaptation that makes certain solutions recur. And so they're thinking that the evolutionary process is not as contingent as Gould thought it was. So there's some disagreement there. Now, in Teilhard de Chardin, he thought that evolution, he had a version of what I described way at the beginning. Let's page back. His was a version of theistic evolutionism that I described at the beginning. He was an evolutionist and a theist. So he was thinking of number one is the right way to think about the relationship of God and the evolutionary process. Again, I emphasize, he did not believe that you had to be an atheist to believe in evolution. Okay? He thought that evolution was set up as a process, set up by God to reach this end state that he called the omega point. Now, Gould, being an atheistic evolutionist, did not like that aspect of the theory. And so they disagreed about the left-hand entry under number one. Is there a God who set things in motion or not? And this is exactly what I'm saying. They disagreed about their theology, but they were both scientists. They both studied evolutionary processes as they occur in nature. And that's what I was trying to get at the beginning when I said that the theory of evolution by itself is not committed to God's not existing. It's not committing to God's existing. It's neutral on this issue.
It seems to me that Paley's argument could also be criticized on the basis of that he did not understand how mindless Janus processes work. In the history science over the last 400 years is that mindless chance processes have a lot of complicated structure. And therefore, one has a hard time assessing the chance that any particular event will happen under a mindless chance process. And yeah, that is a statement of the Paley's argument has gotten weaker when we have learned about Darwin's theory.
I think you're right. Paley was writing in 1805. Not only did he not know about Darwin's theory, which would appear only 55 years later, he also didn't know very much about probability theory and statistics and all the stuff that developed subsequent to his time. He was evaluating two theories, a certain simple version of a chance process on the one hand, and the idea of intelligent design on the other, without pretending that he had covered the waterfront, that he had considered all possible theories. So I think he was being kind of modest about what he was doing, and that's a good thing because no one can ever anticipate all possible theories. The only theories you can evaluate are the theories you know about. And that's what Paley was doing. And just as Darwin opened up new theories that Paley never dreamt of, so the development of mathematical statistics and probability opened up new ways of thinking about chance that Paley really wasn't able to think about at all. So I regard Paley as trying to do something modest. Let me say by contrast that in present-day intelligent design theorists are trying to do something very ambitious. They're not comparing two limited theories. They're trying to show that intelligent design beats all possible mindless processes. All of them, even the ones that science has never even thought of yet. So they have huge ambitions. They want to wipe the slate clean and get mindless processes off the table so that intelligent design is the only theory left standing. And they're trying to do something more ambitious than any scientist will ever be able to do, I think. And I think they won't be able to do it either.
At the beginning of your speech, you mentioned that the topics we're going to discuss had ramifications for the type of country that we wanted to have. How does people's observation of perceived goals and abilities relate to the type of country that we want to have?
Okay. What I had in mind when I said that doesn't connect really with what I was talking about when I was criticizing the design argument. That's where I was asking this question, what is this designer's goals and abilities? What are the goals and abilities we should be assuming here? I was saying we don't know what they are, and hence the argument doesn't work. Let me back up and try to say something a little bit more about the first part of your question where I was talking about the kind of country we want to have. Okay, there's a narrow political problem that we face as Americans, which is the narrow question of what's the curriculum supposed to be in high school biology classes. But I think we all know that there's a much wider issue here. It's an issue of how much religion is going to be allowed to permeate public discourse and public life, laws, and so on. So that's the wider context that I had in mind. Not just high school biology is, relatively speaking, a small issue, but the bigger picture of what kind of society do we want to have. A society in which a certain degree of secularism is preserved in the public sphere. People are free to have religious convictions, of course, but there's no institutionalization of religion. Or do we want to move to a model in which religion is made part of the fabric of how the law works, and not just any old religion, but one religion? I think that's the deeper, more profound political question that we're grappling with now.
I believe you said that the intelligent design argument is reducible to one sentence, if I heard you right.
The theory.
The theory,
Yeah.
And if it's aimed at replacing or providing an alternative, as they claim to do, an alternative to evolutionary theory in schools, I guess this isn't really a philosophical question, be, other than criticism of evolution?
I don't think they have a research program, really. Okay? I think their goal is to introduce religion into public high schools, and as I just said in reply to the previous question, I think that's an element in a larger political agenda. And by the way, this is not, what I'm saying is not speculation. This is just what intelligent design theorists themselves say in a document you can all read on the read on the web, called the Wedge Agenda. Okay, where they state that this is their goal, and intelligent design theory is the thin end of the wedge. It's a device for accomplishing these broader political aims. So I don't think there is a research program. I think they have this idea that you describe a lot of the complicated adaptations that organisms have, like the coagulation of the blood, the vertebrate, and you say, gosh, this must have been made by an intelligent designer. And you keep saying that same sentence again and again. So there's a lot of description of biological detail. That's not a theory. And then there's a very brief comment about the explanation. And the brief comment is nothing different from Paley's brief comment. That's why I say it's not a real theory, and it's not going anywhere. It hasn't changed materially since Paley.
Say that if we could know God, then intelligent design could be a scientific theory, or would be a scientific theory?
If we could get independent information about what the goals and abilities of the designer that we're talking about is, and if this is God, fine. Maybe, intelligent design theorists say often, look, we're not saying that it's God who's the intelligent designer. Maybe it's aliens from outer space who made organisms on Earth. They're trying to be officially not committed on whether it's God they're talking about or some extraterrestrials. Well, what I want to say about those two alternatives is basically the same. If we could get independent information about the goals and abilities, which would then allow us to make predictions, real predictions, about what we should observe in nature, then you could test it. But as things now stand, I don't think we can do that.
So you're saying you can't know this in intelligent design?
Maybe someday we'll know enough about extraterrestrials to be able to speculate in an informed way about what their goals and abilities would be if there were such beings. But right now, I think we're just making it up. Okay, I should say at the outset that I'm not very sympathetic to postmodernism. I guess that here I'm agreeing both with creationists and evolutionary biologists. There's a fact about where organisms came from. It's not something that we simply make up as a kind of social convention. There's some fact out there in the world, and we're struggling to figure out what those facts are. So that's the sort of starting point for me. It's not a postmodern starting point. I think what may be behind your comment is that you're saying that there's a real value to be replaced on respecting the opinions of people with whom you do not agree. And I think that's right. When I say that this theory is not a scientific theory, I'm happy to have people embrace it as a religious doctrine, as long as it's not presented as if it's supposed to be a scientific theory, which to me it is not. And this implies no disrespect, at least in my own mind. Okay, so if that's part of what's behind what you're saying, I'm sympathetic with it.
The story of Uncle Watch
seems to carry the presumption that the designer is more complicated than the watch. And if that's true, then the designer must have had a higher level design. This always seems unsatisfactory to me. Can you carry on with that?
That's interesting. Descartes, writing in the 17th century, which is even before Paley, has this argument for the existence of God in which he says there has to be at least as much perfection in the cause as there is in the effect. And if we substitute complexity for perfection, we have what you were suggesting, that the watch is pretty complicated, the cause of the watch must be even more complicated. And then the cause of the watch must be more complicated still. So where are we going here? Well, I think if you're thinking of this within the framework of intelligent design, you're heading towards God as the first cause. Okay? If you're thinking of this from the point of view of evolutionary theory, you want to be open to the idea that complicated systems can be assembled out of relatively simple components. And so you might want to resist the initial premise you were describing, that I was describing, as similar to Descartes. Maybe it's not always true that the cause has got to be more complicated than the effect. Often maybe it is, but maybe not always.
Thank you very much, Professor Sober, for a very informative talk tonight, and we'll look to hear more from him in the future.